Hi everyone, welcome to Not Your Normal Nerding. Today we're going to talk about perspectives on how people live. When you come to think about it, we're going to talk about a financial perspective as well as how that affects the culture and the regions around them. We're going to talk about this globally as well as locally. And locally, we're going to look at it more of state by state. Instead of county by county, because realistically, if you look at in the United States of America, regardless of if you live anywhere in some of the other cities and so forth, cost of living is roughly about the same. But if you compare it from Oklahoma to, say, California, cost of livings and the way people do things, very, very unique, and just based upon how their world is, their location, how they function, and even their financials as well too. And if you compare it to around the world, of course it's different because the way money flows and the value of money is extremely different in every country when you compare, apples to apples in a sense. So let's kind of dive in and talk about how the world is, and we're going to compare. I live in Oklahoma, so we're going to use Oklahoma as a comparison, and let's go south of the border, and we'll kind of talk about Texas and Oklahoma and how these perspectives and cultures change because of these particular worlds. Let's talk about the financial side, because everybody is like cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. So Oklahoma, the average cost of living in Oklahoma is roughly about $26,000 to $30,000 a year. So of course that means people make lower than that. People make a lot more than that. Apparently, if you're at $30,000 a year, not many people make a lot. It's like the average income is not the best in Oklahoma overall. So you do have your millionaires, but you might only have 5 or 10 millionaires, and you might have 200,000 people who make under $20,000 a year. It averages out to, like I said, roughly about $26,000 to $30,000 average income. If you compare it to Texas, which is just south of the border of Oklahoma, their average income is just a little over $65,000 a year. They have a lot larger population, so their sample or so says, on the most part, there's a lot of people that make pretty decent wages in Texas compared to Oklahoma when you look at the sheer number. It's more than double. So it seems that way. Now let's look at something else, something simple that we can all understand: the average cost of a home. So in Oklahoma, with all the homes that we have here, the average cost of a home is about $124,000, $130,000 for the cost of a home. Well, you compare that to the average cost of a home in Texas is about $240,000, just about double. So if you look at the gist of that, it means you have to make twice as much to be able to afford a home. If you look at a 30-year mortgage on an Oklahoma home versus a Texas home, in general, it costs about twice as much for your mortgage in Texas compared to Oklahoma. So you have to make twice as much money. Simple gist, it makes sense. But does it really make a whole lot of sense? Well, when you just compare those two, it does. But let's look at the perspective of outside of that, the cost of living for everything else around us. So what does it mean overall? For $100 you make in Oklahoma, Texas they make $200. So federal taxes are always going to be the same, so we can make that negligible overall. So let's talk about how that money flows in the system, taxation and other things. So let's look at Oklahoma state tax. So you take another 4.5%, 5% for taxes right off the top of your income. Texas doesn't have state tax, so you get to keep all of that. So you don't have to pay any state tax in Texas. So let's look at when you buy goods in Oklahoma versus Texas. Oklahoma goods, you pay another 8.25%, 8.5% in taxes on top of that. So if you think about just anything else outside of your money, so you have you have right there alone about 13% in taxes you pay in Oklahoma for most of the things you buy, because you've already gotten your state taxes taken out immediately, and then you have another 8% if you buy groceries, if you buy a TV, and so forth. So that tax alone means what? You have a whole lot less when it comes to free money to utilize. So you do have to be conscious, because when something says it's $1, in Oklahoma, you have to pay about $1.08. Now, Texas-wise, yes, they do have sales tax as well too. It's about 6.5%. It is lower than Oklahoma, and of course that makes sense as well too, because you have a humongous population to tax. So you spread the taxation over more people. So the taxation is a little bit lower on sales tax, but that also means you have more money available to you. Lower sales tax, no state income tax, so you have more money available to you to pay for goods and services versus Oklahoma right then and there. So does that make the quality of living in Texas just on those general principles better? Actually, it does. And let's talk about something else that seems a little bit awkward: buying a car. So you think buying a car in Oklahoma versus Texas. The reality is, if you buy the same car, it's going to be about the same price, one place or the other. Well, what does that mean? Well, if in Oklahoma you pay $30,000 for a car, no, you don't have to pay $60,000 for a car in Texas. Maybe with everything or so, $30,000 in Oklahoma, you might have to pay maybe $35,000 in Texas, or roughly about the same cost overall, $30,000. Let's just say both of them are $30,000, which means what? Your money stretches a whole lot better in Texas, because you are making twice the income. So your money stretches a whole lot further. You make $100,000 in Texas versus $100,000 in Oklahoma. The reality of it is, in Texas, you have more money available to you for spending purposes, for buying goods and services purposes, than you would in Oklahoma for the same $100,000. Income-wise, that means if you make $100,000 in Oklahoma, then more than likely you're going to make about $160,000 to $180,000 in Texas. Is it double? No, not necessarily. But does that mean that that's going to be about the right numbers overall when it comes to the cost of living, average wages, and so forth? That would make sense. Now, is that the reality? Absolutely not. The reality is, if you make about $100,000 in Oklahoma, you make roughly about $160,000, $160,000 in Texas. That's what you come to find out in the real world as you go to higher and higher wages. Say a job in Oklahoma that might pay $220,000. Well, in Texas, more than likely, that same job, you'll get very, very close to just about $400,000. So as the wages increase, the income wages increase in Oklahoma, they start looking at almost doubling in Texas. General principles. Lower wage stuff, I'm sorry to say, if you work at Starbucks, wage caps, they're always going to give you the lowest wage possible. They are going to give you great benefits that they can afford for their type of corporation. But the wage scales are still based upon overall state averages. Go figure. They always say they want to put a minimum wage across the country, but the problem is that doesn't work very well, because a federal minimum wage across the country doesn't equate for the cost of living in every country, or every state, I mean. But if you look at, and I'll use this example, and this makes it sound really bad, is if you look at across the country, the average wage, let's just say average minimum wage across the country is $15, and you go ahead and set it to $15. That means the people in California, they get their wage decreased overall because they have a higher cost of living, and their average minimum wage needs to be higher to cover the average cost of living. In Oklahoma, that means everybody gets a humongous pay raise, because the average cost of living in Oklahoma is so low is extremely low compared to everywhere else. Of course, once again, if your home costs half as much as Texas, do you need as much as Texas to be able to afford a living in Oklahoma? Not necessarily. So that's how you have to look at perspective on it. If you make $100,000 in Oklahoma versus a person who makes about $130,000, $140,000 in Texas, do you have a better quality of life in Texas versus Oklahoma? Actually, in Texas, you have a better quality of life because you can keep more of your money, which means you can spend more. If you look at somebody who makes $100,000 in Oklahoma and $100,000 in Texas, surprisingly enough, even with the cost of living being a little bit higher than Oklahoma, outside of your mortgage, outside of other expenses, you roughly have the same cost of you have roughly the same lifestyle, and sometimes a slightly better lifestyle in Texas if you know how to manage your finances correctly. Now, if you look at around the world, the thing about it is if you move around the world, the cost of living is based upon what availability you look at. If you look at currency exchange, that's not the whole point. The point is, how do you look at the cost of living versus the culture of living? Well, the American culture, everyone knows. Everyone in America understands that, hey, we have more wants than we have needs. The cell phone, communication technologies, we have decided that is a need more than a want nowadays. There are some countries in this world where communication technologies, internet access, text messaging, cell phone services, they don't consider them needs. So they don't supply them to everybody. Even people on welfare and so forth who have government-related services and help, they get all these extra services. I look at it from this perspective is it would be nice if I could get it for free, if they can get it for free as well. But that's not looking at it the right way. Other countries, some of them have no cell phone service or minimal cell phone service, and all those are relegated to the upper class or people who have the financial capacity to afford it, which means only the top 20-30% of that country can afford it. Is it going to spread more as technology gets less costly? Absolutely. So it will spread across the world because the technologies to produce them, the services are getting more efficient, and the worldwide spread is getting better. So those things happen. It changes the culture. It makes the culture better overall. But when it comes to looking at each country's cost of living, looks at it the same way as Oklahoma versus Texas. And it's based upon those numbers overall. So we might, in one country, consider, hey, their average salary is $100 a year. Well, just because their average salary is $100 a year, we're not comparing apples to apples right there. We're just comparing our American dollar to their version, their translation of an American dollar. But $100 maybe in this particular country can provide somebody an extremely good quality of life. Can afford them cell phone service, a nice home, what they consider a nice home to be, just improved wealth. For all we know, our version of $100,000 a year in Oklahoma would equate to somebody in another country making only $1,000 a year in that country, and they would have the same quality of life that we do for $100,000 here. Is that true in other countries? Absolutely. So just because you hear, hey, they only make $10 a day, or they only make $120 a month, or $1,000 a year, doesn't mean their quality of life suffers because of it. It's just because we're not comparing the things that we need to appropriately. Placing into consideration most developing countries, they do have taxation, but it's not done very well because there's no true monitoring. So if you look at the average person in other countries, let's just say their equivalent of $100,000 in Oklahoma is $10,000 in their country. The reality of it is they don't have income tax. Their taxation or so even on their goods that they buy, very, very minimal overall or non-existent. Only when it comes to formal businesses, official situations, Well, they have the capacity to tax and monitor it. Everybody else tends to hide and be able to slip away from the taxation system. In America, we have a lot of people who cheat the tax system, but we have a lot of people who understand how America was created, so that they're willing to pay into the tax system. Doesn't mean you're happy doing it, but it does mean that you're willing to support the systems that make America have the capacity to grow and succeed and develop the way it does, and maintain the freedoms that we're used to here. Well, those systems are so in other countries. Well, if they don't have those support, those resources, not only just through taxation, but through goods and services, functionings, geopolitical structuring, so forth. That's why those countries are still not, those countries don't have the ability to advance as quickly as we do. They rely on other countries' technologies and services and goods to develop theirs. So it takes a lot more time. That's kind of how you have to look at the perspective on the cost of living, as well as how it affects culture. If you think of Texas culture versus Oklahoma culture, Texas has much more business opportunities. They have a larger a workforce pool. They even have beaches. In Oklahoma, we don't have beaches that are connected to the sea. We have beaches that are connected to lakes, ponds, and rivers. Texas, they are such a large state. They have so many different geographical options and amenities available. If you look at California, weather is different in California versus Oklahoma and Texas. California has a lot of beaches. They have ski resorts, mountains, and everything else in between. So those things affect the culture on top of the way people live. Those change perspectives because ultimately people like living next to the beach, and the cost of living next to the beach is going to be a lot higher than someplace that's landlocked and has very minimal access. Texas has multiple international airports. California has multiple international airports. Oklahoma has 0 international airports. So if you want to go outside of the country or take a trip outside of the country, you have to take a hopper flight to an international airport from Oklahoma before you can leave the country. Does that increase the cost of transportation? Absolutely it does. So if somebody's a jet setter, having to go from Oklahoma City to an international airport, that's one extra flight that has to be a cost that's associated with it. If you look at something as simple as the cost of gasoline or the cost of electricity, yes, in Oklahoma it's fairly inexpensive. In Texas, California, the cost of electricity, the cost of gasoline in those states, they are much higher. They are at a much costlier premium as well too. But in general, with taxation and so forth, does it balance itself out? Actually, it does. So if you think about it, if your cost of gas in Oklahoma is $2.50 a gallon, you go over to Texas, it's not $5 a gallon. It is roughly about, overall, about $2 and maybe 65 cents, $2.70 a gallon for the same gas. And California, if it's $2.50 in Oklahoma, it is not $7 or $8 a gallon in California. It's roughly about $3.50 in California. So cost structuring wise, just because California is 34 times higher in cost of living than Oklahoma, does not necessarily mean that everything is a higher cost of living. Actually, some goods are less expensive in California than they are in Oklahoma just because of their availability. Concrete, drywall is really inexpensive in Oklahoma. Concrete and drywall in California is actually more expensive. Well, so the cost of a house is less expensive because of that. If you want sushi, really good quality sushi, California is fairly inexpensive. Oklahoma is going to be 2 or 3 times higher for the same quality and the same product. Oil in Oklahoma, like I said, with the cost of living here and the and the reality that Oklahoma is also a energy management state. Yes, yes, gas, oil products or so is fairly inexpensive, and that's mainly the reason why. If you go over to California, they are not a true oil producing state. So, an oil energy management system, so of course it's more expensive over there. Nowadays, things have changed, and oil is starting to become a less and less of a commodity in this world as solar and renewables start taking up their place. And hopefully over time, the cost structures or so for all worlds will even out, because energy will become more and more available without the excess cost of transportation or production and so forth. If everybody generated their own energy, then technically after the cost, the initial upfront cost, energy is free. A power wall or a home battery for any particular place is roughly going to cost about the same. $15,000 in California, $15,000 in Oklahoma. Well, if you make a higher cost, if you have a higher wage in California on average, higher wage in Texas on average, versus Oklahoma wages, yes, $15,000 is $15,000 is $15,000. But California and Texas can afford that $15,000 a lot easier than an Oklahoman could afford $15,000. So why is it that you see less of these systems in Oklahoma? Well, mainly because the overall average cost, the overall perspective is it's not the easiest thing to afford in Oklahoma versus Texas versus California. Because once again, the average cost of living makes your capacity to have a home fairly bad overall, because the average cost of a home in California compared to Oklahoma, compared to Texas, is a lot higher. The average salary in California versus Texas doesn't deviate a whole lot. So you kind of look at Oklahoma's average salary versus California's average salary versus Texas. Well, like I said, Texas is a little over twice as much as we make in Oklahoma on average, but California-wise, compared to Texas, if it's 30% more costly to live in California for just the housing perspective alone, which the average cost of housing is just about $300,000 in California, but you don't make much more on average in California than you do in Texas. Okay, that's where you start saying, hey, it's harder to live in California than it is in Texas, but it is still easier to live in California than it is in Oklahoma. Taxation wise, like I said, sales tax exists, but you don't get taxed on food. Like I said, federal tax is federal tax. Yes, if you make a higher income bracket, you get higher federal taxes as well too. But in the end, the federal taxes will balance itself out, because it allows for people who have the capacity to give more to the country to be able to do so. I am one of those people in a high enough tax bracket where sometimes looking at my income or my federal and state taxes is kind of like frustrating sometimes, because of how much I pay into the system. I'm not one of those that cheat on my taxes, so I go ahead and pay the full price on it, because in the end, that's the only way I have a conscience. But everybody wants to find ways to decrease the total taxes they pay, and that's absolutely fine, because the more you can keep, the better your quality of life can be. I will say that my quality of life is okay compared to what it could be. So that's the reason why. It's like I have no reason to try to hide more money or anything like that. Yeah, I don't make a lot of money. I don't have a large spending capacity. But as of right now, I'm fortunate where I have a good quality of life overall. So that is the perspective on looking at cost of living, as well as how people spend their money, how people have the capacity to spend money. Thank you.